maybe like the third go around. I don't even know what go around that was. This was like the sixth scheduled date. So what we're going to do is go through as much basic information as we can. I'm going to show you, share my screen, go through some slides. We're going to be very light on sources because sources take time, and we're aiming to cover as much basic information as possible so that everyone feels like they got like a crash course in Hilchos Niddah. And the chat is open. Please feel free to type in questions. I think the plan will be that we'll record this piece and then we'll take questions at the end. And then everyone can feel comfortable to either ask questions themselves or type it in the chat, whatever works better for you. I am going to start by sharing my screen. And I'm going to do it just like this. Here we go. Slideshow. Oh, look at us. We look so fancy. Okay. As I said, it's really a refresher course, so we're not going into tremendous detail. The goal is just to refresh. But obviously, if anyone has any questions, that's why I'm here and that's why I'm doing this, really just to get us all back on track and sort of make this information accessible and familiar once again. Okay. There we go. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to be using some of the things that I had posted on Instagram as sort of a way to get us going. And then you'll see I added some other information as well. Okay. So back to basics. This is going to take 30 seconds. When we say Hilchos Niddah, when we say the concept of, or the mitzvah of Taharat Mishpacha, family purity, we are talking about essentially a combination of several bodies of law into one. Now, this was a process that took place in the Gemara, that where the psukim from the Torah were essentially interpreted. So there is Torah level law, there is rabbinic law, and then there are further derivations of rabbinic law, all of which come together in this beautiful package, this beautiful, very detailed package that we know today as Hilchos Niddah. It is really a combination of several other areas of law of Tumah and Tahara, purity and impurity. If you've had this conversation with me before, you know I don't really like those words, but since this is a crash course, I'm not going to give you my whole spiel on Tumah and Tahara really more accurately being translated as accessibility and inaccessibility, which is something that I learned from Rabbi Ephraim Buchwald and Mrs. Pesci Neuberger. That's the language that they both use. And that is really far more accurate and far more helpful in our lived observance of Taharas Mishpacha, rather than associating these things with pure and impure, which have very positive or negative connotations. And that's not necessarily what we're going for. So what we are focusing on are today's observed laws of Hilchos Niddah. And my thing that I repeat over and over and over again is whatever you know, whatever you think you know, if something you are not 100% sure, it pays to ask a question. You lose nothing by asking a question. Questions can be asked anonymously. They can be asked, to someone that you have a relationship with. Certainly I'm available to answer questions by text, by phone, by WhatsApp, by DM, whatever it is. There are a lot of people available and eager to help you keep this mitzvah. And that's my spiel about that. Okay. Oh no, that's not what we wanted to do. There we go. Let me just review quickly what we are not talking about tonight that are still really, really important. We are not talking about the mitzvah of Ona. The mitzvah of Ona is a husband's obligation to his wife to please her, to give her sexual pleasure. Not talking about that tonight. As well, we're not talking about any of the other related obligations or responsibilities that a husband and wife have to each other. Separate. I mean, it's related, obviously, but it is separate from our discussion tonight. We're not going to talk about all the different life cycle events that could happen in a woman's life and how they might impact her observance of these details or of this mitzvah. Just can't cover all of that, but I'm just putting it out there that these are all significant things that should be addressed, and we'll probably throw everything that we're going to study tonight up in the air so that any of these things might cause you to have significant questions and significant changes in your observance of the mitzvah. Same thing goes for birth control, the challenges of birth control, the positives of birth control, the different types, what is halachically permitted, what is not permitted, what is maybe permitted under certain circumstances, and all of that. Obviously, we are not able to address tonight. We are not talking about the hashkafa, the philosophy, the beauty, as well as the very substantial and significant challenges of keeping this mitzvah, of which there is so much to talk about. And I just need to acknowledge, oh gosh, okay, here we go. back to my slideshow. There we go. Okay. So we are not talking about that either, but just let's keep in mind that it is significant. There's so many significant things we can't talk about, but another one are medical procedures and a woman's overall health. Not going to be able to address in detail, but again, very significant as far as a woman's lived experience of keeping this mitzvah. And finally, preparation and immersion in the mikvah. I'm really just going to very, very lightly touch on it. There's just, I don't think, time in the 45 minutes that we allotted for tonight to go through that. In the end, I have to tell you, there are quite a few questions that come up in this area, and we can do another review class maybe on that subject, or these, this dual subject. But if you have questions, definitely ask, and maybe we can address some of this at 8:45 after we've gone through the material on the other subjects. So that's what we are not going to talk about. Now let's talk about what we are going to talk about. Oh no, why is it? There we go. Okay. How does a woman become a Niddah? This is the starting point for observance of this mitzvah. This is the famous pasuk that describes what happens when a woman experiences a flow of blood. This flow of blood has to be from her uterus. It has to be experienced bivsara, right? So you see, these are the key words here, bivsara, in her flesh, which we understand to mean there was some kind of experience that women used to have of knowing that they had become Niddah. And there's a lot of interpretation by the Rishonim, the Rambam, and many others as to what it meant that a woman had a hargasha, which is our interpretation of this word bivsara, in her flesh. For our purposes, we are not going to spend time addressing this, but recognize that if a woman were to have this sensation, she would become a Niddah d'oraita, a Niddah on a Torah level. So long as this is absent, there are halachic authorities who feel that this entire area of Jewish law is not quite at the same level because we're missing this one component of a woman becoming Niddah according to the Torah. There are many more poskim who feel that so long as the woman has had a flow of blood, that is d'oraita level Niddah today, Torah level Niddah. Again, not really our place to talk about in detail, but just to recognize that that is a significant piece. What is super relevant for us today is that a woman, in order to become Niddah, has to have a flow of blood, not a stain necessarily, although that could make her a Niddah, but the Torah level Niddah requires a flow of blood, which we'll talk about in another slide, like what is halachic blood versus, let's say, medical blood. And it has to be from her uterus. Okay, so a flow of blood from elsewhere, which I know that we all know this already, but it is important to recognize that all of this is delineated specifically in the pasuk in the Torah. And it talks about the fact that the woman becomes tmeya, as well as the fact that it takes 7 days until she can, it doesn't say go to the mikvah. We learn that from another source that is applied here. But like all other types of tum'ah, all other types of ritual impurity, a woman is required to go to the mikvah in order to make the shift from tameh to tahor official, from ritually pure to ritually impure official. A person would need to immerse themselves in the mikvah. And in this case, this period, I shouldn't use the word period, this time frame lasts for 7 days. Okay. And that's Torah level. I want to address one thing that comes up like oh so very often. And I encourage you, don't ever hesitate to be in touch. Everyone always starts a text or a call by, I'm really sorry to bother you. You are never bothering me. That's why I'm here. And that's why I spent all this time studying. It is to answer your questions. So this is maybe one of the most common questions that I think people get. I can't speak for other people, but I guess myself and a couple of the other women and Rabbanim that I speak to regularly have told me this is a very common question for them as well. And that is, how does the woman know if she's actually having a flow or if what she is having is staining? It is not accurate that every time a woman sees blood on her underwear or on toilet paper or on a liner or a pad that she has become Niddah. That is not true. That is not, as we talked about, that is certainly not the Torah level. And in fact, the sources we're not going to look at because of a lack of time, but always happy to share them with you. The sources we won't look at are the sources in the Gemara that talk about the whole topic of staining and how does that fit in vis-a-vis the laws of Niddah. And what is very clear, and I should have put it in, and I apologize that I didn't, is the very well-known Gemara in a discussion of Rabbi Akiva and his students, where a woman, and this is where you see so much where how things have changed, but a woman essentially goes over to Rabbi Akiva and asks him her Niddah Shaila. She basically, and he's in front of his students, and she says to him, I saw blood. And he says to her, well, maybe you have a wound, maybe you have a makkah of some sort. And she says, well, I did have one. He said, well, maybe it's the kind of wound that could have reopened. She said, yeah, it healed already. And he said, well, maybe it could have reopened. And she's like, yeah, it's possible. And he tells her that she's tahora. She's not Niddah. Go home, be with your husband, he says. The Gemara continues and says, all the students are looking funny at Rabbi Akiva and saying to him, what was that? The woman saw blood and you told her she was fine. How could that be? And he explains to his Talmidim, and this is really the basis and such an important thing to keep in mind when women say to me, I don't know, I really feel like I must be Niddah because I'm seeing something and I don't know, is this statement from Rabbi Akiva, which is that the entire body of law relating to staining, right, which I'm going to delineate what that is. But when it comes to staining, Rabbi Akiva explains the whole concept is there, lahakel. It is there within that we are lenient. The whole concept of staining is a chumrah in and of itself. It is a stringency, because as we saw, Torah law is a woman has to be flowing blood. And there is definitely a distinction between flowing and having some staining or some spotting. And so Rabbi Akiva says very clearly to his students, right, in a case where a woman has a stain, and certainly in a case where a woman has a stain that we could attribute, even though it wasn't clear that that's where the blood that she found came from, right? She didn't know that it came from her wounds, but because he could attribute it to another source, and we're dealing with an area of law wherein we can be lenient because the whole concept itself is a stringency. So within the stringency, we're going to be lenient. He tells her that she is tahora. That is a very important source that I left off the slide, so I apologize. And it's within that vein that I want to mention the difference between a flow and a stain. Most women, certainly from the time, before they have children, if they're, when they get to that stage of life, God willing, are very familiar with what their normal period looks like, what their flow looks like. And a lot of women will say to me, like, I have a little staining in the beginning, and then my period comes, and then I have a little staining at the end. Everything that's not the flow itself is negotiable halachically. And what's going to matter is, where does the woman find it? How does she find it? And that will be in the next slide. Some things that I often will ask women when they will call or text or whatever and say to me, I think I got my period, but I'm not sure. I think this is when my flow started, but maybe it started at this time when I experienced this. And these are the questions that I ask them. So these are just things for you to keep in mind. I would still encourage you to ask someone and talk this through with someone. But here are some of the things that Rabbi Alman, who was the posek that I quote all the time, and who is really a gadol in our generation and somebody really that we are blessed to have as a resource for all of us and a source of support for all of us. These are some of the questions he asks. Was she wearing a liner? Was she wearing a pad? If she was wearing a liner, the woman, was that enough? Meaning, did any of the substance, the discharge or the blood, did any of that come off the liner? No? Okay, because liners are not very absorbent. So if all she saw was contained, that's the word I was looking for, is contained within the liner, that's a stain. She's not tmeya. Okay, that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is if a woman is wearing a pad, and we're going to talk about pads and liners being white in a moment. If she's wearing a pad, is she changing it regularly because it's soiled, because it's like, not quite full? If it's full, for sure, it's a flow. If it's even half full, we would probably call it a flow. But if she's really only changing it and it has like not a lot in it, and we know pads are very absorbent, so we're keeping that in mind, but she's really just changing it for hygienic reasons, because whenever she uses the bathroom, she feels like changing her pad, but she's not looking at it being like, oh, thank God I'm wearing a pad and not a liner. If she's in that stage, she doesn't have a problem. She is not tmeya. She's not needs it from that. If a woman is not wearing anything and she's wearing colored underwear, as we'll talk about in a moment, then the question he'll often ask is like, did it soak through? Did it go through her underwear? Would it have gone through her underwear? That potentially sounds more like flow than like a stain. The one thing that I have to tell everyone, I mean, I have a lot of things that I have to tell you, but one of them is never, ever, but ever, ever. I think I probably wrote this 2 different times in the slides here. Don't ever put in a tampon until you are like 120% sure that your flow has started. Right. So a lot of women do it in anticipation of their flow starting, and then they take it out and there's nothing on it, or there's like a tiny dot on it. If there's nothing on it, it's fine. But if once a woman has put in a tampon, she enters into a whole other area of halacha, where we're going to see in a moment, the laws of stains do not apply. So once something has been inserted vaginally, we view it as a bedika, which we'll also talk about in a moment. And there's really almost no room for leniency. So do not put in a tampon until you know your flow has started. And very often that is the case, that it could take a day, 2 days, 3 days. And that's super frustrating for a woman to have made herself niddah unnecessarily early. Same goes for a bedika. We never, ever do an extra bedika that is not required. We'll talk about when they are required, but we never do one just because I was curious, right? We've all done it, myself included. We have all done it at some point and lived to regret it. So we hopefully only make the mistake once. If you haven't made it yet, be in the very wonderful club of women who haven't made that mistake and try to skip it, right? Just, you only do bedikot when they are required. Okay. Now that we've talked about how a woman, wait, did I skip one? Yes, I think hold on. Hold on. Okay, next one. All right. Let's talk about what happens when, I'm just looking to see what order I did this in. Okay. I think I messed up the order when I was organizing it, but we'll stick with the order that it's in. Okay. Let's talk about the basics of counting. From the moment that a woman realizes that she has become niddah, meaning she has had a flow of blood, or as you may have seen on this earlier slide I put down here, there might be other ways that a woman might have become niddah. We're not going to talk about those, but, you know, a woman from giving birth or from seeing a stain in a way that is problematic, which I'm going to talk about. But if a woman has been established as niddah, this is how we get her out of it. These are the basics of counting. Okay, the basics of counting, as I mentioned before, there are 7 days that are required by the Torah. We saw that in the pasuk. What the sages did, and we're not going into why or how, but what the sages did was essentially based on Torah sources, but it's a rabbinic application. They added 5 days to the 7 days. And what the reason why they did that, in a nutshell, is that on a Torah level, these 7 days have to be free, not just from blood, but if a woman were to be emitting zera, were to be emitting semen still, that were to be discharging, or that would to be coming out of her body, that would invalidate the day on which she sees it. And when that happened, that became very, very confusing for people. So in order that the woman would not have this challenge and she would make it through all 7 days, hopefully without any blood, and definitely guaranteeing that she would not also be still discharging or emitting any zera, any semen from any intercourse that she would have had before, is there's a minimum in the Talmud of 3 days where the zera, the semen, is considered to still be viable, and it is still causing tum'ah. And for a number of other reasons, a suffix here and a suffix there, meaning a doubt here and a concern on this side, they ended up with 5 days. The 5 days which precede the 7 days that are mandated by the Torah are very much rabbinic in nature. They are also up for debate when it comes, as you'll see in this slide, when you look at the Ashkenazi versus the Sephardi community. The Sephardi community, though, is not so monolithic. It's not like, oh, you're Sephardi, you must do this. It's, oh, you're Sephardi and you follow the Shulchan Aruch, then you do 4 days plus 7 days. Oh, you're Sephardi, but you follow Harav Mordechai Eliyahu. Oh, you keep 5 days like the Ashkenazim. I'm so sorry for you. Usually is what I say to people. The Ramah, who is the posek for the Ashkenazi community, and as I mentioned, Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, people who follow that halacha, that stream of minhag, so they keep 5 days. Everyone keeps the 7 days, but within the Sephardi community, those who follow the Shulchan Aruch directly, or those who follow the more modern posek of Rav Ovadia Yosef, they keep 4 days. I will not put up any conjecture as to which people from which community and which country in the Sephardi world keep what, because I've heard just so many different versions that everybody should do the Masorah, whatever they have, their tradition from their parents or their grandparents or their husband's parents or their husband's grandparents. And if you're not sure what that is, ask the person that you ask your halachic questions to. As I mentioned, these 5 days or 4 days are based on separating from intercourse. So it begins when the woman starts bleeding, because that's when she begins her halachic separation from her spouse, right? So it's a minimum. If her bleeding finishes by that time, well, then great, she can start the 7 clean days. If it doesn't, then unfortunately, she has to wait until the bleeding has subsided so that she can begin her 7 clean days, which are, again, Torah level. When does that shift take place between the 5 or 4 rabbinic days and the 7 Torah days? How does that happen? That happens on either day 4 or 5, depending Ashkenazi or Sephardi. The way that the woman enters the second phase of the 7 clean days is by doing an internal examination, what we call a bedika. This first bedika has a special name. It's called a hafsek tahara, right? Literally a pause that allows for the tahara to come afterwards. It's not kala classes, so like I didn't bring bedika class in front of me and show you how to do a bedika, but that I'm happy to show anyone. I could send you a little recording of myself. I'm not one for making reels, but I could send you a little personal one-on-one. I could send you a video if you're interested or curious. So the woman inspects herself by taking a bedika cloth, putting it on her finger, inserting it vaginally, rotating it as best she can inside all the different clefts and folds. And as the woman's body changes, obviously her ability to get into those different parts of the vaginal canal and, as high up as she can go, obviously will change. As I tell all women, you are not looking, this is not something that should take you more than 10 seconds. 12 maybe, not more than that. A woman should be careful not to hurt herself. She should be careful that her hands are clean. All of the sensible things that we sometimes know, but sometimes forget, are things to keep in mind. So a woman does that particular examination, that inspection, what we call a bedika, or the first hafsek tahara. It needs to be done sometime before sunset. Yes, it is true. And I've written about this a lot on Instagram because I still find this is something that really baffles women. Many women learned that it has to happen. It has to happen within 2 hours. Some have even learned within 30 minutes of sunset. That is incredibly stressful. It's accurate that is the ideal A+++ gold star time to do it. However, it is 100+% for a woman to do this inspection, this hafsek tahara, the bedika, starting after sunrise on that day of either day 4 or day 5. Obviously, there's no point in doing it if a woman knows she's still actively bleeding. But if her bleeding has stopped, she should do this check, this bedika, whenever it's convenient for her. And for most women, the best time to do that is in the morning. Again, it has to be after sunrise, but often the morning time is a much more practical time for a woman to get a bedika done rather than right before sunset, which, as we all know, tends to always be at a difficult time, right? It's carpool, you're in the grocery store, you're commuting. There's just a lot of things going on at that time, certainly in the winter in Montreal, where shkia sunset can be as early as 4 o'clock. I don't know that it ever gets earlier than 4. I think Shabbos, like the earliest Shabbos, is 3:45. So I think 4 is about the latest shkia, but that is an incredibly challenging time. So I encourage all women to do themselves a favor and check in the morning. If you have time and you're able to do another one before sunset, like tavo alayach bracha, a bracha should come on your head. That's beautiful. But you should know that if you don't check again before sunset, you're done. You only need one bedika, one hafsek tahara. There is also a halachic standard, we'll call it, of doing a moch tachuk, which is something that some poskim today say is not necessary, but it is something that we still teach. The reason why some poskim say today it's not necessary is because we do the moch, which is essentially an extended check. It's a hafsek tahara or a bedika, where the bedika cloth is inserted vaginally like it was before. I always tell women, make sure to rotate it just in case you need this to count as your hafsek tahara, because if there's no rotation, it won't really count. So put it in, insert it. This should go in like literally right before sunset. And there's a lot of different timing. How long does it need to stay in? You should follow whatever your halachic authority says. I'm a 20 to 25 minute person based on Rabbi Alman, but some people have the minhag to keep it in 35 minutes, 50 minutes, and sometimes longer. It is halachic standard. It by no means is a game changer. So if a woman doesn't have a chance to do one, then she has not lost anything. She lost an opportunity to do a nice thing. But if it causes discomfort and a woman speaks to her posek or her halachic authority, and that person says to her, oh, no, this is causing you stress, or this is causing problems, or you were clean on the bedika, but now you're doing the hefsek, and now you're doing the moch, and it's causing problems, skip it. That very often will be something a woman hears. I don't encourage women to skip it on purpose without checking with someone. But practically speaking, if a woman doesn't do the moch, it does not affect her ability to go to the mikvah. It's a missed opportunity. It's a nice thing to do, but it's nothing that she should make herself crazy about. The thing that is important to remember is that when a woman's flow started, she should jot down somewhere. I think the phone is the best option these days, rather than a piece of paper that you will likely lose or put your shopping list on, or God only knows what else has happened to me, and I'm sure many of you. Either to write it into your phone in your notes or in your calendar, or to download one of the apps that does all this calculating for you. And that will help you know, when is it that I am anticipating going to the mikvah? When do all my days start? And, how will this process go? If the woman's flow began before sunset, then that is her day one. If it began after sunset, then the next day is her first day. So if you're expecting your period, it's always great advice to just check and see before sunset if it started, because then you might save yourself a day. You may not. Hard to tell, but it's worth trying. Okay. Let's look at checking, the idea of checking. How does a woman, when does she have to check? What are the obligations as far as checking? So we talked about the hefsek tahara, which is the first check. Ideally, a woman, before she does her hefsek, should wash herself. It will help her if she cleans herself out. I recommend taking like a bedika cloth, wetting it, doing it in the shower, let's say, and inserting it and cleaning yourself out that way. Long gone are the days where the rabbis and college teachers and everyone used to tell women to douche. I think that, I don't even know if you could buy douche anymore. I'm not sure. It's really not recommended by anyone. But the concept is correct, meaning the cleaning out vaginally and making sure that we've gotten rid of any remnants, any leftover blood that might have been there from the menstrual flow, or what caused the woman to be in needs in the first place. That is recommended. Once the woman has started her count of her 7 days, unless she gets halachic permission to do so, she should not wash herself before she checks. I say that because there might be cases where that is advisable for a woman, and she should ask. So the hefsek tahara is done. That day 4 or day 5, since separating, since bleeding, becomes day 0, and her 7 clean days start the following day. Okay. The other way to remember it is the woman, when she does her hefsek on what's today, Wednesday. So if a woman does her hefsek on Wednesday and all goes according to plan, all goes well, she can anticipate going to the mikvah next Wednesday night. Okay, that would mean Thursday is day 1 of her nikiyim, Friday is day 2, Shabbos is day 3, etc. You can follow along, count on your fingers yourself. But that is an important distinction. I have spoken to women more than on one hand who spent like a lot of years not counting properly. If you have any doubt, if you have any question, check with somebody, or get the app. If you're not comfortable discussing it, get the app. It'll help you know when exactly to do everything. And it's important. Once a woman is so committed to doing this mitzvah, she wants to do it right. I know women really take this very seriously. Even the ones who are not so committed to all of the details, they still want to get the basics right. And that's why we're having this conversation. So really, the number of women, like I said, who just misunderstood and haven't been counting properly is significant. So if you're one of them, don't feel bad. You're in great company, and you can fix it going forward. So you can check in with me or anybody or the app or et cetera to work out the count. In an ideal, perfect world, a woman would check herself twice every day. That's according to, as you'll see, that's according to the Shulchan Aruch here. That's the lichatchila. That's the gold standard. There are poskim today, including Rabbi Mordechai Willig from YU, who says that 1 a day one daily, is also a lechatchila standard. That's also a gold star standard. You check every single day, tavo alayich bracha. A bracha comes on your head, right? That's good. That's very good. 2 is even better, but 1 is really also, according to Rabbi Willig, 1 is like, that's as good as it gets. Most women are taught like it has to be 2, to the point that they're like, oh, well, I didn't do the 1 in the morning, so I might as well not even check in the afternoon. Like, no. So long as you check 1 at one point during the day, you are good. This is why I always encourage women to check as soon as they wake up in the morning. You're in the bathroom doing your morning routine anyway. Wash your hands, clean yourself properly, do whatever you need to do, and then do your bedika before you even leave the bathroom. And this way it's done. If you remember to do another one before sunset, beautiful, amazing. But then you don't have to worry as the sun is going down that you missed a chance, you missed an opportunity. This is really significant on certain days, because if a woman misses her chance to do the hefsek on that day 4 or 5, to turn it into day 0, she's just pushed off her going to the mikvah by a day, right? There's no like makeup with the hefsek. It's really, that is the most significant bedika. Following that, checking the next day, which is day 1 of her 7 days. And we said, ideally, she's checking days 1 through 7. But if is a situation where a woman cannot complete all the checks, she forgets to do 1 or 2, or they are causing irritation, or she's having some sort of staining issues or anything like that, always reach out and find out. The bare minimum is the hefsek, checking on day 1 and checking on day 7. But I'll let you in on a little secret, which is that there are times when a posek will permit a woman to go to the mikvah if she has only done the hefsek and day 1 and a different day. Depending on the situation, if it's a very extenuating circumstance, there's a possibility that such a thing would be allowed. Same with doing a hefsek, checking on like day 3 and day 7. Also might be allowed. It is always, always worth asking. For women who feel like I'd like to minimize the number of times that I check myself for whatever reason, I encourage them to not just do hefsek 1-7. I encourage them to also pick an intermediate day, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, just because if a woman only checks hefsek and day 1 and tells herself, I'm going to remember to check on day 7, she might forget. And if she hasn't checked herself since day 1, and day 7 comes and goes, and she also forgets to check, and she was expecting to go to the mikvah that night, she's not pushing off by one night. She is most likely pushing off by a full week, because that is too many days to go without a bedika. So that's a cautionary tale to please try to make sure to get those basic ones done. And here's my other pitch. Don't ever do a bedika. That is not required. That's not called for. Okay, those are the basics of checking. So hefsek, day 1, day 7, most significant. I recommend highly doing one on one of the intermediate days. Okay. I'm not sure why this slide is here, but we'll just go with it. What happens when a woman sees blood? And we'll talk about this in 2 different ways. Either she is already tmeya, meaning she's in her 7 clean days and she's trying to get herself to the mikvah and she sees a stain. What does she do? The other situation that could happen is a woman is tahora. She's already been to the mikvah and now she's staining and she is freaking out because she doesn't know what just happened. And she's wondering why this is happening and how it affects her status. So everything depends on the color of the stain, the size of the stain, where the stain is found, and if we can attribute it to something else. So here are the very basics of color. If something is, as you'll see at the bottom here, if something is a non-Niddah color, it's yellow, it's light brown, like the color of coffee with milk. Those colors are not a problem. A woman never needs to worry about any of those colors or any of those shades, right? Light brown, I guess, is its own shade, but you hear what I'm saying. Like a brown that is definitely a brown that has no red, no orange, no pink, no black, none of those colors, she's good to go. If, however, the woman has a stain that is any shade of red or pink or black, and in here, we see that dark brown is like the most complicated one, then she has a question to ask. Let's go through some of the questions, right? If it's a problematic color, so let's go to the next question. Since it was either red or pink or black or something, or a dark, dark brown, what do we do about it? Well, let's see. What size is it? How big is it? If it is smaller than 19 millimeters, and this happens often, people are like, oh, I never stain like that. No, it's not true. I've seen plenty of things. So I could tell you lots of women have teeny tiny dots. And even if we were to add them up together, which we would, depending on where we found it still wouldn't add up to the size of a gris. It's also not a problem. This is only true, though, when it is found on certain types of material. So let's go over that. If a woman, If a woman finds a stain on, let's talk about her body first, okay? If a woman finds a stain on her body, this would also apply to her husband's body, meaning like he found her blood on his body, that's usually following intercourse, then the laws are much stricter, okay? A woman finding a stain or blood on her body is the equivalent of her finding it on white cotton or white linen. You may be familiar with the concept of something that is mekabel tuma, something that receives tuma, or like a tuma conductor is sometimes the language people use. What this basically refers to is any natural fiber, any natural material, anything that's not synthetic. So like I said, cotton, linen, wool, silk, those kinds of materials, those are potentially problematic because they are mekabel tuma. What is not mekabel tuma are plastic, rubber, things that are not natural fibers. Like wood is potentially a problem, but something that is plastic, even if, as we'll see, white is potentially a problem, but even if it's white, if it's not a material that is mekabel tuma, it's probably not going to be a problem. The thing that is probably the most relevant for women today is the kula, the leniency of Rav Moshe Feinstein, who says that things that are disposable are not mekabel tuma. This therefore applies to toilet paper, tissue paper, liner. Pads are like, some of them have real cotton in them, but most people think a liner as well, even though it's attached to the underwear and the underwear is mekabel tuma. Most poskim today are comfortable saying that it's not mekabel tuma. This makes no difference if a woman has an actual flow, because then we're not in the laws of stains, we're in the laws of flows, the laws of flow. But if it's a stain and it was found on an item that is not mekabel tuma, it's not a tuma conductor, then we can use the leniencies of the laws of stains. We can say, oh, well, I know it's a problematic color, but, and I know that it's too big. It's a big stain, but it was found on a panty liner, for example, or it was seen only on toilet paper or tissue paper. Not a problem. We can ignore it. Okay. This includes white toilet paper or a white liner. There is such a thing as black panty liners. That's like a whole other, a whole other topic, and would allow a woman potentially to ignore even more. And okay, I mentioned the idea of disposable. So if a woman sees something that is a problematic color and it's a problematic size, but it was found on a material or an item that is not problematic, she is not tmeya from that stain. If, however, it was found on something white, her white underwear or her white bed sheet or her white pajama pants or her white towel or her body or her husband's body, then there's a lot to talk about. And a woman should not necessarily assume she's Niddah, but there is a very good chance that she would be. And she should ask the necessary questions to determine her status. The other thing that we talk about is what Rabbi Akiva talked about in the Gemara, which is maybe you have a makkah, right? Maybe you forgot that you had a terrible mosquito bite that you were scratching the whole night, or you have a hemorrhoid, or you might be bleeding from another source. Then if that's the case, and we can attribute the blood to that, then the woman would not be Niddah from that. All of this is relevant on things that were found on when the stain is found outside the woman's body, right? As soon as something is found that was inserted vaginally. So that would be a tampon, a bedika cloth, the husband's body, right? All those things, because they were inserted vaginally, that would cause essentially automatic Niddah. The rules of stains apply and are discussed at great length in the Gemara based on the likelihood in those days that women would find blood from squashed bugs and all the other things that we don't like to think about, but they lived very not clean lives. And even though we no longer have those bugs and we no longer have the high probability of the blood that we find coming from them, we can still use those leniencies, but only when the stain was found outside a woman's body. Okay. So the take home lesson is always ask if something was found, a stain was found on something that was inserted vaginally. Again, a bedika cloth, a tampon, the bedika cloth is probably the most relevant, it comes up the most often. Then if it's a problematic color, it doesn't matter how big the stain is. It could be teeny, teeny, tiny, but if it was determined that there's no cut, there's no other source for that stain or for that blood that was found on the bedika cloth, it will potentially be a problem. Still always worth asking because you never know. Okay. in the last few minutes, because I really do want to have time for questions, I want to just address this, like, I don't even know what I would call it. It's a behemoth. People are so scared of vestos, the concept of being required, being obligated to anticipate when a woman's next period is coming. Also, this is based on a pasuk in the Torah, and there is a debate whether this is a d'oraisa or d'Rabbanan. Most people feel it's d'Rabbanan. But that being said, there is an obligation for a couple to calculate. Could be the wife, could be the husband, excuse me, to calculate when the woman will bleed next and to separate during that anticipated time. There are a few ways that we calculate this. For women who have a very predictable regular cycle, they have to only calculate based on that very predictable regular cycle. A regular cycle, Vesas Kavua, gets established by something happening 3 times. It follows the laws of Chazaka, which is 3 full times. So if a woman has a certain length cycle, which is known as a Vesas Haflaga, lahaflig, like from to skip. So that's the interval one. So that would take 4 periods with the 3 intervals in between in order to establish that cycle, that Vesas Kavua, that established cycle. And that only can happen if everything matches up. It happens during the day, 29 days apart each time. But if one of those times it happens at night, then it's not considered a pattern. That's not a halachically valid pattern. Most women, if they're not on hormonal birth control, fall into the other camp, which is women who have a Vesas she'ino kavua, a non-predictable, I would even call it like a not halachically valid cycle, in the sense that we don't believe you have I shouldn't say cycle, not a halachically valid pattern. You don't have a real pattern just because something happens once or even twice. We don't view that as having any real halachic weight. But we have this obligation to anticipate when we're going to bleed the next month and then separate for that 12-hour time frame. So we've got to do something. So our practice has become that for the woman who does not have a regular cycle, she calculates these 3 that are in this all the way on the right here. She calculates these 3, both according to the Hebrew date that she bled, the interval since her last period, as well as what is known as the Ona Beinonis, which is the average number of days that Chazal basically said, most women bleed by this time. And if you haven't bled, if you get past this point, well, then fine. But most women bleed by day 30 or day 31. That's 2 halachic approaches. I think most people go by 30, but there are some communities that follow 31 instead. That's a different opinion in one of the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. And so it's worth knowing if you're a 30 or a 31. There is also a chumrah known as the, I'm not even going to talk about it, but there is a stringency that you may have heard about of not just separating for 12 hours, but separating for 24 hours. And that is not something I ever recommend people take on unless it's part of their family custom or their community standard. The most significant one is the last one, the Ona Beinonis, because when a woman bled last month on the 13th of the month, really has no bearing on if she's going to bleed again on the 13th of the following month. And Chazal recognized that. It's not a pattern. It only happened once, right? So she should anticipate it. But if she forgets, it's not such a big deal. And the haflaga, the interval, if last time her periods came, 29 days apart, well, then next month she should count from today that the period started till the next month, 29 days. Okay, she should really separate from her husband during that time, and at both points of separation. And most poskim are comfortable with the couple just separating from what we would call certainly from intercourse, but even just from other acts of, real passion, we'll say. And more than that, and we're not, I forgot to say, we're not talking about harchakos. We're not talking about the laws of distancing or separating. I knew I forgot something. That's the other major area of law that we're not touching on, but we know that the couple is separating, and that's really all that we focused on for tonight. Plenty more to discuss about that. So these 2 are significant, of course, in an ideal world. Just like I said before, in an ideal world, a woman checks herself in the morning during the 7 clean days and checks herself again before sunset. But if it doesn't happen and only happens once, that's okay. So that's what we call b'diavad. So in these cases, a woman, ideally, if she does not have an established pattern, ideally they should separate during that 12 hours of the daytime or the nighttime, depending on when the last period happened. They should separate. And during that time, she should ideally check herself. However, if she forgets, lo kara klum. It's okay. We recognize that we're kind of grasping at straws, trying to guess when her next period is going to come. And these two are viewed as, I would say, relatively much less significant. However, when it comes to the ona beinunus, and this is really an important thing, because a lot of women say to me, this is too much, I can't deal with it. So if there are women who are willing to work with the app, the Mikvah calendar app, beautiful. You have no calculating to do. You have no thinking to do. It'll tell you everything you need to do. Then beautiful. But if for whatever reason a woman says, no, this is too much for me, it's hard enough for me to keep these laws, give me the most basic thing I need to know about Vestos so I can know in my head that I'm doing things as well as I can possibly do. This is the one thing I tell her. The ona beinunus, which is considered the most serious, I guess, of the three, is actually viewed as though the woman has a regular cycle. In other words, we recognize these two don't have a lot of halachic significance. It happened once or twice. But this one is viewed with much more significance. And therefore, a woman would count 30 days from her last cycle and last period from her last flow and count. And on that 30th day or 30th night, depending on when the flow started the last time, she would separate from her husband for the 12 hours of either day or night. And she should check herself. She should do a bedika. If she forgets to do a bedika during that time, according to the Rashba and according to all poskim, she is asura ad shetivdok. She is forbidden to her husband until she checks herself, right? So that is not a deoraisa, it's not Torah level, but it is a strong recommendation that the woman and her husband should not resume relations until she checks herself. So yes, ideally it should happen during that time, but if it doesn't, it's okay. Don't make yourself crazy. Just check as soon as you remember before resuming relations. Okay, that is in a nutshell the concept of vestos. I did not address vestos haguf, which are bodily symptoms that can also not predictably, that can predict a woman's cycle, a woman's flow beginning. Those can also establish a pattern. A woman can have a very, very specific pain or ache or other physiological symptom that comes only related to her menstrual flow. It can't be like, for most women always ask me cramps. Like, no, because if you might have that same feeling because you pulled a muscle once, or because you ate something that didn't agree with you very well, then that violates, like that makes it, that puzzles it. I don't know what the English word for that is, right? Okay. These are just some things to keep in mind. If a woman is taking hormonal birth control, that by definition wipes out all that stuff we spoke about with the vestos, with anticipating a period. And a woman should consult with her halachic authority. Rabbi Alman, my halachic authority, encourages women to go by the pack that they're on, right? So obviously this is only for women on the pill, or a woman using the NuvaRing would essentially have the same thing, which is when the active pill stops and she starts the placebo, or when she takes out the ring, then the however long it typically takes for her to start bleeding, it's at that point that she would then separate. So let's say a woman stops her active pills on Sunday, and it always takes 2 days, and then she starts bleeding that night. So 2 days, and then that night, that's when she should separate the following month. Many women develop a very predictable pattern on hormonal birth control until they start going pack to pack. And that we're not going to talk about, but that also changes everything. So just to bring out the point that this will alter the way that the woman would keep the laws of vestot. A lot of women say to me, it's too much, I can't handle it. It's like, I keep Niddah, but I don't keep vestos. So I gently try to say to them, you're keeping most of Niddah, you're just not keeping all of it. Is it as serious as some of the other aspects of Niddah? For sure not. And if a person has to pick and choose, I understand why this is the one that sometimes gets left behind. But I encourage women and let them know that it's not as hard as it seems. There are apps available. There are people available who are happy to do your calculations with you. And once you're doing this mitzvah, we might as well try to do it as best as we possibly can, to the best of our ability. And just keep in mind that if a woman is on any type of new medication, that will affect her cycle. If she's sick, that could affect her cycle. Obviously, pregnancy and going pack to pack and all of those things. One thing that I'll just, mention about birth control that a lot of women don't know, and I don't know why the doctors don't tell us. The pharmacist sometimes does, but the doctor does not, is that antibiotics very much can impact the efficacy of hormonal birth control. So a lot of women are confused, like, why am I all of a sudden bleeding? Oh, I'm on medication from strep. Could those two things be related? Yes. And what that tells you is also your birth control is not working as well. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind and to discuss either with your doctor and perhaps your spouse and maybe your halachic authority. Just something to keep in mind that a lot of people don't realize. The last thing I want to mention, because I see I went over, but I'm basically done, because we didn't talk about harchakos, and we didn't talk about preparation, and we didn't talk about immersion, but we could do that another time if there's interest. I just wanted to mention one thing. This is probably one of my favorite sources on the subject, and that is when it comes to preparing for the mikvah. We know that the obligation is for a woman to prepare herself. The key points are to wash her body, wash and comb her hair, and make sure there are no barriers. And that last check of checking to make sure there are no barriers, what's called iyun ba'alma, where a woman just, she feels or she looks if she has a mirror and she has good light, which hopefully she does. I was recently hearing a story about somebody who went to the mikvah, which was in their camp lake, and how, there was only a flashlight. So they couldn't really use the light for this last iyun, this last inspection that a woman is supposed to do. And so you have to feel with your hands very, very, very carefully and make sure that there are no barriers in that way. That being said, those are the really important pieces. Washing the body with soap, and making sure it's clean, washing the hair and making sure it's clean, and then combing it and making sure there are no knots, as well as any other hair on the body, making sure that there are no knots. That can be done with the fingers, just separating the hairs. And right before a woman goes into the mikvah, she should inspect herself from head to toe as best she can. Then she goes into the mikvah and she immerses 1, 2, 3, 12, however many times she likes to immerse, and goes through the process and comes out and she's tahora, and it's beautiful. Listen to what the Ramban has to say. I'm going to read it in English because I just think it's important for everybody to keep this in mind. It is not good for a person to be overly stringent regarding the laws of chatzitzot. Those are the barriers that a woman is not allowed to have on her body when she goes into the mikvah. And they should not search for reasons to invalidate her immersion with a simple matter. For if so, there would be no end, right? What he's saying is, it's one of my favorite phrases, ein l'davar sof. There literally is no end. The little piece of skin, the little this, the little that. A woman is under no obligation to make herself crazy. She does the best that she can. If she wants the attendant to check her and make sure she did a decent enough job, fine. But if a woman feels like, I did it, I spent my whatever, however long it takes her, there is no prescribed time. I know that is that's a myth. That's a mikvah myth, that you have to sit in the bath for X amount of minutes, or that it should take you this number of minutes to clean yourself. Sorry. That is not accurate. The most important thing is that a woman should take her time and not rush. But anything beyond that, there's only one source that talks about when a woman has to take an hour to prepare. Sorry. And that is actually if she's immersing on Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night. And that's a whole other discussion that we're not going to talk about. But otherwise, there is no prescription that a woman needs to take a certain amount of time to prepare. Okay. The Ramban also mentions that the same not being overly scrupulous, not being overly stringent applies to the immersion itself as well. A woman should not come out of the mikvah and say to herself, oh, I think I closed my eyes too tight, or I think I didn't open my fingers enough. She should trust herself that since she knew the laws when she went in the water and she did what she always does, that she should not come to second guess herself and make herself crazy, because again, ein l'davar sof. There is no end to that line of questioning and that line of thinking. So I apologize. That was like really fast. If there are questions that anybody wants to ask, I'm happy to answer. Anybody want to